So this hull is completely filthy. Tried to clean it off with the air tool and some cleaners and it still wouldn't come off. So I took a low pressure pressure washer to it just to knock the dirt off of the air and debris, so that way it could get down to fixing everything that needed to be fixed on it and making sure that everything was serviced correctly. And yes, I was very careful to make sure that I didn't get any water inside the engine housing. So there was some exhaust side piston scoring. I just wanted to try it and see if it would work, but it was a no-go. So I was hoping to replace just the piston on this one, but the jug had some scoring. It does have the nice slant fins on there. I did replace it with the OEM Stihl. In order to get better access to the jug, I went ahead and took the handle off. That just gives you more room to move around. So this is an Arctic saw with the heated handle. It has the wiring element connected to the generator. So when you take it off, you just had to be a little bit more careful. I chose not to disconnect the wire, so I just worked around it. So there's 4 bolts that hold the jug in place. I went ahead and loosened all 4 of those bolts. Next, I pulled the muffler off so that way I could lift the jug off. The last thing to remove is a rubber boot. There's a flathead screw. You can undo that and it'll take the clamp back. And then once you get the clamp off, you can go ahead and pry on the rubber boot, get it off of the jug, and then that way you can go ahead and disconnect the jug from the unit. I have a specialty tool that I use to pry on that rubber gasket. If you try to use a screwdriver, you're going to end up puncturing it. So my tool has a rounded end. You can usually find those through Stihl dealer. So this piston was trashed. It had some scoring on there. Notice the vertical lines running up and down. I'll wipe that off and show you here. It either had a lean run issue, not enough mixing the gas, straight gassed, or the carburetor wasn't adjusted correctly. So just enough right there to pull in those rings. So now I'm going to remove the piston. You got to take the ring out of the side. Go ahead and use this little pry tool like that, and it pops right out. I go ahead and remove the recoil. That way I got more room to work in extracting that piston. So with the retainer ring gone on the opposite side, I just take a small socket that fits the hole and just lightly tap the pin through. Just like that, falls out the other side, and then you can remove your piston. The carb side of the piston was in rough shape too. It was a gray color and all the machining marks were gone. So when you're installing your new piston, look for the little arrow right there at the bottom. That arrow is going to point towards the exhaust side to make sure that your piston is installed correctly. I installed a new needle cage and lubricated it as well. So this particular piston already had the retainer ring on, which is on the bottom side there. So I went ahead and put the new piston pin in there, and then I'll go ahead and put the other retainer ring on this side. So I like to use press fluid, put a little bit around the end there so that way the ring seats easier. I'm not gonna lie, these Stihl snap rings are a royal pain. Just make sure if you're not used to using these that you have a couple extra ones on hand, because they can easily fly out of the area and get lost. You're gonna put them in there with needle nose pliers in a rotating fashion, and then once you get it started, you're gonna work it around with a screwdriver and then push it in with your fingers as well. Make sure that the ring is fully seated and it's not bent at all. I always go ahead and clean everything off that I can with a rag, so that way I have a better surface. So make sure you put your gasket back in place before you put your jug on top. I have this piston block that I use that'll hold the piston up, so it'll make it easier to put the jug on there. Go ahead and just slide it in place right underneath there. So again, more press fluid around the rings there just makes it easier to slide onto the jug. You're going to need to have a ring clamp. That's the only way to compress the rings, so that way you can get the piston inside the jug. One very important thing to keep in mind before you start compressing the rings is there's going to be a little gap in the rings, and that's going to seat on a pin. Make sure everything is aligned. I'll show you right here. If you try to compress your rings while they're over top of that pin instead of gapped around it, you're going to end up busting your rings. The pin positions are offset on different sides of the piston. Once you got the piston rings aligned with the pins, go ahead and put the compression clamp on there and go ahead and lightly squeeze it down. If everything is aligned correctly when you have it clamped down, you should not see any of the rings showing. If you're seeing the rings showing, it's because you do not have something aligned properly. Now go ahead and seat the jug on top of the piston. Look underneath, and once you make sure that everything is aligned the way you want it, you can slowly push down on that while slowly releasing the clamp at the same time. If the jug passes over the rings, then you know you have it seated correctly. After your jug is seated, go ahead and remove the clamp and then the block. Now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the boot. I intentionally leave the jug loose so that way the boot's easier to get on. Again, use a round nose pry tool. Do not use a screwdriver or you'll puncture your boot. Once you know your boot is seated, make sure you go ahead and tighten the clamp. Now I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the jug. Make sure that your gasket is aligned with the holes so that way you don't wreck it. I get all the screws started before I tighten anything down. So go ahead and get every screw in there, and then once they're all in, then go ahead and tighten it. Do not over torque these screws, otherwise you'll snap them off and then you'll have a bigger mess. You can find screw torques in your user manual, or you can ask a Stihl dealer. This particular hole on the jug is for a decomp valve. I wasn't putting one in this unit because I didn't have one to begin with, so I went ahead and blocked that off. Now I'm going to reinstall the handles and all the other hardware, so I'll go ahead and just speed through this really quick and we'll get to the carburetor. I did clean that out and I ended up having to replace it. It wasn't holding it idle even after adjustment. So this carburetor is pretty straightforward. Just take off the nuts that are holding those two plates on. One of them is going to have wires on it. All the extra wires that are inside this area are for the Arctic unit, which controls the heated handles. So a replacement carburetor that was on there was a Walbo. I was able to replace it with exactly the same carburetor. The only slight difference was there was just one little clamp on the bottom of the carburetor where the electric unit plugs into that I had to swap out. Otherwise, everything else was exactly the same. So I just had to be careful when I was putting this carburetor back on, just making sure that I had all the wires tucked in nice and neat so that way I wasn't pinching anything in the process. I always check the throttle, make sure it's functioning properly before I put the air filter back on. And lastly, putting the bar and chain back on there. The customer gave this to me, like I said. The bar and chain were actually fairly new and in great shape, so I reused them. So here's a completed unit, fully clean, fully serviced, new top end, new carburetor, everything fully functioning, fresh fuel, fresh bar oil, all set, ready to go. So let's try her out. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like the video and subscribe to my channel.